he already had this idea that maybe we could view cancer as a kind of an adversary, as a way to conceptualize new ways of treating cancer. Because one of the concerns he had and still has is that it's when we discuss treatment of cancer and development of new methods of treating cancer, maybe we need to also think about cancer in new ways to be able to leverage all these developments and that are going on right now in genetics and precision oncology.
This month, Dr. Tony Ingesson joins the podcast. Dr. Ingesson is the Associate Professor of Intelligence Analysis at Lund University in Sweden. He's a trained munitions remover and naval patrol leader. His thesis is mainly focused around subcultures, military decision-making, and administration. Since 2016, he has primarily conducted research in subjects related to intelligence analysis and decision-making. Recently, Dr. Ingesson collaborated with medical professionals to study how intelligence analysis can be used to defeat cancer. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Well, welcome Tony Ingesson to the podcast. Thank you for showing up, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, this is going to be an excellent conversation. But before we begin, I would like to give you a few minutes to just, give a background on yourself, who you are, promote anything you'd like to promote, and then we could start talking about intelligence analysis, something I'm very passionate about.
All right. So I'm an assistant professor of intelligence analysis at Lund University in Sweden. And I have a Ph.D. In political science. And I wrote my dissertation originally on tactical decision-making in combat situations, where I studied quite a few cases. I had 8 case studies in all, ranging from submarines in World War II, including American submarines, first year of combat operations against Japan. And some other stuff, and it's out there. It's open access. It's available for free as a PDF file. So if anyone is interested in that kind of thing, you can read it for free. And then after that, sometime after getting my PhD, I switched over to intelligence analysis, and that's what I've been doing most of the time since then. And quite a lot of the stuff I've been putting out there is, including the peer-reviewed research stuff, is open access. So again, you can find it, you can read it if you're interested. And I've been studying mostly stuff like counterintelligence, but also industrial espionage and methods, that kind of thing. I like pretty hands-on kind of stuff. I like tradecraft. I like things that you can find in archives and sometimes also more contemporary sources, but hands-on stuff, concrete stuff, not so much the more abstract things. I like this. I like the stuff that's exciting. Basically. Yeah. And before I went to academia, I should mention maybe that I also have a background in the Swedish Armed Forces. I was originally in the Air Force Volunteers. Then I served in the Army and an EOD unit. Then I was recruited into the Air Force, where I was an analyst on air-launched munitions. And then I had kind of a hiatus from the military, went to study here in Lund and worked private sector for a while. Then I went back to the Armed Forces. So I've also worked in the Navy. So it's kind of funny. I worked in Army, Air Force, and Navy, just pure coincidence. But then I left the Navy to pursue my PhD here in Lund, and I've been here ever since.
Well, that's an incredible career. And I don't know if you guys in Sweden do the same thing, but like there's this sort of camaraderie. Some Army, that I was just in the Army, but I've done, joint forces with like special operations and things like that. But whatever service you were in, there's a lot of camaraderie. So then you make fun of the other services, the Air Force. We call it the chair force, just sitting around not doing anything. And then we have comments about the Navy and the Marines, and it's all vice versa. Is that something in Sweden that you guys do?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. And that's one of the advantages of having served in all 3 branches, is that I can make fun of the other ones without being, being too offensive. of course, I mean, I spent a very short time in the Navy. It was just, I mean, it wasn't even a year, and I was sitting in a bunker underground, so I wasn't even on a ship. So I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
I'm not sure it actually counts, but technically, I was in the Navy for a while. Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, I know I wanted to get you on here, and I'm just so grateful that you did come on, because I wanted to talk about a tweet that you put out recently about, and then, correct anything that I'm saying that's wrong, but it's a peer-reviewed paper on using intelligence analysis to fight an adversary, and that adversary is cancer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's a good summary. Yeah.
Okay. How did that start?
Well, it started, my co-author on this thing, David Giselsson Nord. He is a professor at the Division of Clinical Genetics here in Lund. He's also a senior consultant pathologist. So his experience of cancer is both as a researcher, but also as a doctor who actually treats cancer. And he's specialized also in childhood cancer. And so he came to me because he had this embryo of an idea where he wanted to talk about strategy and maybe intelligence, I think, and how that could be applied to cancer, because he already had this idea that maybe we could view cancer as a kind of an adversary, as a way to conceptualize new ways of treating cancer. Because one of the concerns he had and still has is that it's when we discuss treatment of cancer and development of new methods of treating cancer, maybe we need to also think about cancer in new ways to be able to leverage all these developments and that are going on right now in genetics and precision oncology. And you have to be a bit careful now when I'm presenting this, because I'm not the medical guy here, so
right.
I'm trying as best as I can, but I might get some details wrong. But this is basically my way of interpreting all this. And so we had these discussions, and he explained to me how cancer works, and the problems that arise when you try to treat it. So one of the ideas here is that cancer reacts to treatment, basically. So cancer doesn't have a consciousness. So cancer is not an intelligent adversary in any way. It has no agency, kind of. It just reacts to things. But the way it reacts to things is also one of the things that makes it so challenging. So one of the things I learned from David was that cancer is not this one thing that you have in your body. It's actually something he called a clonal landscape. So when you have cancer, you typically will have several different kinds of cells. And these cells may compete with each other because they just want to grow, and there's a limited amount of resources they can use to grow, and there's limited space and all that. And sooner or later, I mean, they're going to kill the host. But they compete, and his idea was that maybe we could exploit this way that cancer works, because traditionally in these clonal landscapes that you have in a tumor, for example, there might have been one kind of cell that is vulnerable to whatever treatment we have, chemical treatment, chemotherapy, and there might be another kind of cell that isn't vulnerable, that is already resistant to this kind of treatment. And then when you apply the treatment, the first kind of cell, it just dies off, basically. But then you're left with the other kind, and now the competition is gone, and this will just keep multiplying, and it's not vulnerable to this kind of chemotherapy, and maybe it's not vulnerable to anything, and then it will kill the host. Mm-hmm. Or maybe we just have to ramp up the treatment, but at some point the treatment just becomes too toxic and too challenging for the body of the host, and then the treatment will kill the host instead. So he explained it this way to me, and my contribution to this was that we could think about this in terms of asymmetric warfare, because we are not cancer that's fighting cancer, so we are asymmetric in the sense that cancer is something completely different from what we are. So the cancer is dependent on the human body as a host, but the body is not dependent on the cancer, for example. That's one of the...
Right, it's kind of like counter to that. You know, the body is
So
is depleted by cancer.
Exactly. But it's not an external thing. It comes from the body, but it becomes like an external thing. But so one of the things we discussed was that I introduced to him the concept of reflexive control, which is something I've picked up from studying primarily Soviet counterintelligence methods. And I was always very fascinated by this. And I don't think we should regard reflexive control as this specifically like Russian or Soviet thing, because I think basically one of my ideas that I've had for some time and tried to express in different ways is that I think what the Soviets did when they codified reflexive control as a theory was that they just picked up on these very general principles for manipulation and deception, and I think they made a lot of good work on developing these and clarifying them in ways that you can keep them very concise and you can apply them. But I don't think they're like this specific thing, because I think they have existed for a long time in the West as well, but just we maybe have been using it more intuitively and maybe not codifying it. And that makes it more difficult to transfer this kind of knowledge. Whereas I think that the main advantage of using reflexive control as a framework here, theoretically, is that it's clearly formulated in these old Soviet doctrines. So I talked to David about reflexive control, and I said that reflexive control is basically about trying to get your adversary to do something that benefits you without them realizing it. You make them position themselves in a way that you can exploit in order to destroy them. So this is something we were working on, and so one of the ways that this can be done in cancer treatment is that if we use this example I told you before, when we have two different kinds of cells, one is vulnerable to a kind of treatment we have, and the other kind of cell isn't. Well, then maybe we enrich the environment for the first kind, the one that is vulnerable, but instead of striking against it, we let it exist, and we actually maybe stimulate its growth, which is very counterintuitive in a treatment context.
It's going to be a tough sell to a patient.
It might be. But the thing is that we want this first kind of cell to outcompete the other one. So if it works, then the first kind of cell might replace the second one to the point where the second one is so weakened, or maybe even destroyed in the process, that we create this situation where we can strike the first kind of cell with a treatment and just wipe it out, or at least reduce it to the point where it can be surgically removed or treated with some other kind of method. But so the thing is that we try to like trick the cancer in a way into a position where we can strike at it more effectively. And this requires strategic thinking, basically. You have to think about cancer as an adversary, and you have to think several steps into the future, like playing chess or something like that. And this, from what I have gathered from talking to David, this is not something that has been done traditionally in this kind of medical context, because they have been more focused on the here and now, short term, and just evaluating what works and what doesn't work, but not thinking several steps ahead like this.
Yeah, and so, well, that's such the great thing about intelligence analysis is you have to think outside the box in order to complete something. You know, if you want to attack the adversary and defeat the adversary, you've got to not only think like the adversary, but think outside of the box. Do something that they would never expect. And that's why I think it's so interesting with what you're doing with cancer. You guys going through like an F3EA process, like the find, fix, finish, exploit, and analyze?
Yeah, that's another part of it. So we have several components in this paper. So reflexive control is one of them. And this like the F-thread concept. The acronym is
and it keeps changing. I mean, I've seen
they always do.
Live now and all this kind of stuff. I like to stick with what you said, like the F thread or the F3EA.
I just find that that's easy one to pronounce instead of just
right.
They'll probably add letters along the way. But the thing is, that's also another thing that David brought into the mix, was that he wanted to get cancer treatment to be more focused on this kind of cyclical process. So normally you would find the cancer, of course, fix it, like in the sense of here locating where it is and how much it has spread and so on. And of course, then you want to engage the cancer and destroy it with whatever kind of treatment you're using. And so far, I mean, there's no major difference. But he wanted to pick up on the F-thread logic by also adding that after treatment, the treating doctor should also try to immediately, or quickly try to get an updated picture of what's going on, and get more data on the way that the treatment has worked, and more data on like the kind of the cells of the cancer that may be still around, and so that we could exploit this information and prepare for another round of treatment before you get into the situation where the patient has already started to deteriorate. Right. So he wanted to be more proactive and more like have this cyclical process spinning all the time until the patient has been cured, instead of being, because the way he explained it to me is that cancer treatment has been very reactive and not so much proactive. Once you initiate treatment, you're basically, the cancer is reacting and then you're reacting to the cancer. And this is maybe you can even use the OODA loop kind of metaphor here, that you want to keep acting, taking steps to destroy the cancer without waiting for it to react to you all the time.
Right. Yeah, it's that's incredible. Have you guys looked into any like AI or machine learning to
I
kind of do the analysis portion of it?
Yeah, I haven't done so specifically because we started this a couple of years ago, so before like the really big AI hype. But I know that David has an entire team of people doing research on cancer, and I'd be surprised, frankly, if they haven't started to already check out this kind of a venue, because I know that they have been working on things like game theory before and stuff like that. So right. I know they're pretty quick to pick up on new ideas. But I think that might be a possibility, sure.
Yeah. Now you said he came to you to talk through it and be sort of like the subject matter expert for how intelligence could do it. What was that conversation like?
It was very, very stimulating, because I mean, when you're working with intelligence studies, maybe you're used to talking to people in law enforcement or military, or fellow academics who might be in political science or sociology or psychology or something like that. So I mean, those kinds of discussions are something that I'm fairly used to. But this was completely different, talking to someone who comes from medicine and talks about cancer. Because I knew very little about cancer, like most people, I guess. And he had some idea about what he wanted to know. So he knew more about strategy than I knew about cancer. But I was able to also introduce some of the more detailed stuff like reflexive control and the asymmetric dimension. And so we had a lot of great meetings where we just sit around and he would just explain cancer and I would explain some intelligence concept, and then we would see kind of how we could connect the dots and how we could make these things work together. And I would pick up on whatever he was saying and say, "Oh, this reminds me of this thing." And he would, when I explained something, he would say, "Oh, that's like this thing." And so it was a really creative process. Really enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, it sounds amazing, because I know if an oncologist or something would come up to me and have asked me the same thing, I don't have a PhD, so not somebody like in the intel world that is super knowledgeable. I've just been doing it for so long. I've got all these tidbits. But if an oncologist would come up and ask, I don't know what I would say. I don't know if I would have the confidence that you had to say, yeah, let's go through this. Let's kind of combine our powers. Were there any books that helped you in the process?
Not directly. Indirectly, I think is more the thing here. So one of the things we got from a reviewer actually was Ed Lutwak's book on strategy.
Yeah.
Not so much the details, but just the idea of framing it as this counterintuitive strategy, the paradox, what Lundberg calls the paradoxical logic of strategy. I think something like that he calls it. So that was just one of the ways of framing it. But otherwise, I think it came more out of studies of a lot of it was Soviet counterintelligence doctrine and methods and cases, because that's the kind of thing that I'm most familiar with. David also had he already knew about F-threat, and he had some ideas about counterinsurgency, and he had some ideas about strategy. So my contribution was to say that I don't think we should. I don't think it's that rewarding or productive to look at it as counterinsurgency. I think it's more like this adversarial perspective where we use reflexive control, and more like look at it like from this counterintelligence point of view. So I think that was my main contribution to this.
And what I really love about this is, especially, for over the last few years, at least in the United States, and you could tell me how it is in Sweden, sort of this intelligence analysis gets dumped in with covert operations and the three-letter agencies, NSA, CIA, and it's looked down upon. If you're doing intelligence, you're doing something covert. You're part of the deep state. You're trying to do something negative towards the people. And then open source intelligence takes off as well, gearing up. The Russians are gearing up on the border of Ukraine, and open source intelligence now becomes a vernacular within the English language. And there was a lot of, I would say, bad thoughts from some people who didn't understand it, that you're just trying to control a narrative. You're trying to control this. So what I really love about this study is it's something tangible that you can attack, that you can do good work in, and maybe highlight other things that intelligence analysis can do good work within the community.
Yeah, I think, and this points to actually a very interesting cultural difference, which is something I'm working on in another project right now, but it's going to take a while until that's finished. But it's probably going to be a book chapter. But I've studied U.S. counterintelligence, especially in the 80s, quite a bit. Also to some extent in the UK, but mostly counterintelligence in the US. And I've also studied counterintelligence in Sweden in the same time period. And I think it's very interesting, and also, I mean, just what you pick up in general in terms of attitudes from society and such. That, I mean, in the US, intelligence, my impression is that intelligence is very strongly associated with foreign intelligence gathering on other countries in particular. And I mean, and with that, I think, yes, it's not that far off to associate it with covert action. Yeah. Whereas in Sweden, intelligence has historically not been all that strongly associated with foreign intelligence, but very strongly associated with counterintelligence, because we've had the Soviets and the Russians just next door for a long time, and most of that time we haven't exactly been getting along all that well. So we've had this intelligence threat from the Russians and the Soviets and then the Russians again, and we've always had to cope with that. And in the 80s, for example, intelligence work in this country was to a very large extent serving the interests of counterintelligence. And that also, I think, has had the effect of making intelligence work more accepted in Sweden. So here in Sweden, I think people in general they don't have that kind of negative attitude. To some extent, there's been a bit of change. So after Snowden and all that,
that was a huge one.
Yeah. So signals intelligence here got caught up in that, for example, got a bad rap from that. But I think that has kind of quieted down a lot in recent years. And now I think that we're still at this point where people have a lot of trust here in this security service, for example, and they are part of the intelligence community here. And then we have our Signals Intelligence Agency, which also, I don't know exactly. I haven't got solid data on exactly how people perceive it, but I'm getting the impression that it's more nuanced. Probably it's not all
Right.
negative, because again, it's people associate intelligence with protection of the state and protection of the people here more, I
Yeah.
think, than they do in the U.S.
Yeah, I do, and I think that within the U.S. there is sort of this. I would say there's a lack of confidence in the intelligence community within the U.S. because of some of the things that have come out. One of Snowden coming out and highlighting what the NSA was doing, and what I hear from a lot of people is that, with the American people is, so, well, we've been lied to for so long, and so the more covert an intelligence action is, signals intelligence, one of our highest levels of classification that you have, just because of how we capture things within signals intelligence. And so it has to be very covert. And so when it does come out and people, I would say, don't understand it and then realize that what they were being told wasn't the whole story, they lose confidence in that organization. But I would think that Sweden must do a much better job of like highlighting what the intelligence community is doing for the people there.
Yeah, I think to some extent, I think it doesn't need to be highlighted that much, because the threat from Russia is kind of obvious to most people. So you don't have to remind people of it, because it's always at the back of people's minds, I think. And it has been for such a long time. I mean, a lot of people forget, but even here, ironically, but for quite a long time, Sweden was a very militarized country, kind of a bit like Israel in the 60s and 70s during that in that sense, but not quite, not that far. But we had conscription, which we still do. It was suspended for a while, but was reintroduced again. And we had pretty significant spending on the armed forces. I mean, we had a pretty significant Air Force. At one point, our Air Force was, I think, like the fourth largest and most capable in the world. And we built a lot of stuff domestically, invested a lot of money in that, built fortresses, fortifications, coastal artillery batteries, airfields. And one of the things that I remember from, and this is something I also studied when I did my PhD, was that I think that the view of war in Sweden has also been very different from the view of war in the US, because the traditional like Cold War view of war here was that war would come to us and be fought on our soil, and that would be extremely destructive. It was always assumed that we would suffer terrible losses. We would probably suffer a partial or complete breakdown of command and control. Cities would be bombed. Civilians would be killed en masse. We would suffer mass casualty events. And the purpose of training people was to ensure that they would keep on fighting. And it was like part of the doctrine was that the country will never issue a general surrender. And if someone tells you that, they are lying. So you will never, it would consider treason to surrender unless you are rendered combat ineffective. So if you're wounded or you're out of ammunition or whatever, then fine, you can surrender. But you may never surrender otherwise. You will, even if you're just like one company left of the entire army, you're expected to fight until you're rendered combat ineffective or killed, basically. And I think this mindset, this kind of like besieged mindset, or just one step removed from being besieged by the Russians and Soviets, because I mean they have such vast numbers and they have like a lot of hardware and it's close. It doesn't take long for them to get to us. I think this also means that people accepted secrecy and intelligence in the service of protecting the country, because I think the perceived threat was always closer at hand. I think not just nuclear war, but just conventional invasion.
Yeah, it's not even, like you say, it's just not even just nuclear war. It's, getting your conventional munitions downrange and killing civilians. And that would happen in an invasion of Russia. That's what we're watching in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, exactly. I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is kind of vindicates the view that people had here, that's exactly what people expected, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, so we know Russia is kings of misinformation and disinformation. Is that coming through in Sweden at all? Or are they getting any like in media or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, they have some. I mean, there's always going to be some people who are going to, well, be sympathetic to Russia to some extent. But my impression is that it's been tougher for them to employ misinformation and disinformation in Sweden. For example, they tried to establish a local media presence some years ago, back when they were having more success with this kind of thing. But it didn't work at all. It didn't work here, so they had to pretty much roll that back and cease those operations because it simply didn't work. And I think, and they like to accuse us of being very Russophobic.
Yeah.
And I I think people here have more. Again, I think it's also connected to all the things I mentioned before about this long-standing, like, I don't know, hostility towards Russia. Is that people are generally quite skeptical of what the Russians say and do. Some people, I mean, they're just going to try to be, both siding it or whatever, or trying to. But I mean, after the invasion of Ukraine, I think it's been very, very. They lost a lot of even the few people who were willing to defend them. I think had to tone it down a lot because can't really say that kind of thing here anymore.
Yeah. So do you think that was a miscalculation? Because I mean, and I've been talking about this for a while, that Putin has said it himself. The next, he wants the USSR back to what it was. He spoke about Finland. He's spoken about Sweden by name, saying that they should be coming back into Russia. So did he make a miscalculation going into Ukraine?
Oh yeah, I think we can. Okay. I think we can. That's one of the few things I think we can say for sure. There was. I think that this invasion, the full scale one. I mean, they've already been engaged in
right. That's an important note. They've been at war with Ukraine for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, at least since 2014.
Right.
But if we the 2022 full scale invasion, I think is going to go down in history as one of these really major intelligence and decision-making blunders. I mean, it might even replace at some point the Yom Kippur War of '73, which is the kind of thing, like standard scenario we use in teaching, like intelligence failures and decision-making failures. And I think, but of course, the only problem I see with using it as that is that they're probably not going to be very open with the kind of information
right.
and background that we would need. But I think it's safe to say, I think, that this was one of the worst intelligence failures of all time, probably. Yeah.
Why do you think that was? What went on?
That's an interesting thing. Interesting question. I think. I mean, it's kind of speculative. It's very difficult to answer, but I get the impression that probably had the classic problem of having people who have been agreeing with each other for too long, and they all try to appease and please Putin as much as possible. And if they think that this is what Putin wants to hear, then that's what they're going to say, and vice versa. If they think that Putin doesn't want to hear this, then I'm not going to be the one to tell him, or maybe I'm going to tone it down and wash it a bit and make it look better, and politicization of intelligence and all that. But also, I think it's quite possible that maybe the FSB should be seen as one of the major players in this. That the FSB I've never had the impression that the FSB was particularly competent at doing qualified intelligence work. Less so than either of the other two ones.
Right.
And I think the more responsibility you put on the FSB, the greater the risk of something like this happening. But of course, it might just as well also be that the other two, the GRU and SVR, that they also played a role in this. But it's I mean, it's a bit frustrating because it's very difficult to look behind the scenes here and see what went wrong. But I think it's safe to assume that they thought that things were very different and that things would play out very differently, and that I think that was based to a very large extent on a very erroneous view of what Ukraine was and how Ukraine would react.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that, and I think it's very interesting what you brought up, because I will agree with the fact that I think the failures came from, and it happens in the United States. So within the intelligence community here, we have everything's based off of your customer. So if you're disseminating a report at the end of the day, it's for a specific entity or person. Well, for a lot of our intelligence community, that's the president of the United States. And so that's the person who's going to guide your intelligence collection. It's going to guide, up to even what that person wants to hear and what they don't want to hear. And so we in the U.S. have had a ton of intelligence failures because of that simple fact that, well, this isn't something the president wanted to hear, so let's not look into that or discuss that. What is the concept within Sweden as far as the intelligence community? Who's their customer? Who do they go to?
Well, I mean, it's somewhat ironically, it's very secretive in Sweden. Once you get past like the lower levels of stuff like law enforcement, intelligence, and such, it gets pretty quickly. It gets quite intransparent. And another ironic thing here, which I also find very fascinating, is that Sweden is I mean, legally we have a lot of transparency built into our system. So I mean, the default for all public kind of documents and decisions is that they must be made public, and that anyone can request and get quickly basically any kind of file except the classified stuff. But
right.
The classified stuff, on the other hand, is really classified. So stuff does not get declassified easily here, and the stuff can stay classified for a very long time, even if there's a scandal or something like that. So one of the reasons I've done so much work on American counterintelligence and American cases is because once there's a scandal, I know that, well, there's going to be some stuff released, and there's going to be like congressional oversight is going to kick in, and I'm going to get all these nice reports. I mean, they're not going to give me all the details, but they're going to give me a lot of information. That doesn't happen here. It doesn't exist here. You can have, at some point, you can have, if something bad happens, and I mean, we've had our fair share of bad stuff as well. Then you might have a similar mechanism where someone investigates and then they publish a report. But usually they're going to be a lot less detailed, and then they're going to have this classified appendix that you can't see, and that's where they're going to put all the useful stuff. So it's just a more closed system, and I think which also I think is a result of this long-term hostility and long-term threat from Russia and before the Soviet Union, that secrets are kept, and they're kept for a long time. And once something has been deemed important enough to be secret, it stays the secret, basically. So we had maybe you heard about the criminal case we had a spy inside the intelligence community here.
Yeah.
And he was assisted by his brother. And a lot of the trial was kept classified. A lot of the evidence, witnesses, etc., was classified, and I don't think that's going to be released probably in anytime soon. I mean, that's going to probably take a very, very long time. So the public only received some information, but even then, we received an unprecedented amount of information. We received a lot of information. A lot of the evidence was still made public, but that's because they wanted to make it public just to be able to get him convicted and to gain support from the public for the conviction. But normally you don't get that. So the customers, to return to your question, I think the customers, of course, are the government. In our case, we have the prime minister and we have the ministers of government, and they're consumers of intelligence. But then we also have like the security service. They're specifically the counterintelligence and counterterrorism parts, but also they have a part of them also work on VIP protection, and then they also have protection of like the constitutional and democratic order of the country.
Right.
But they receive intelligence and they can task intelligence to support their work. And then we have law enforcement. Is of course they have their own intelligence capabilities, but they also have information sharing and such. So I usually tell my students that it's important to note that intelligence exists on several different levels and serves different purposes, and they're all very important, but some, of course, are more secret than others. So in law enforcement, it's going to become open a lot faster than you would expect from in a national security context.
Yeah, and that's a good point to be made. So we have the same thing. So outside of the intelligence community, the agencies, what we would call the 3-letter agencies, we have an intelligence community that is actively involved with police officers in policing, not on the ground policing, but helping the community understand what the adversaries are, and then helping the police find other people. And like you said, that's less covert. What are the kind of students that you're seeing now? Or is it military people, or are you seeing an influx of regular students coming in? They want an intelligence degree.
It's a mix, I'd say. And the courses we have in intelligence, we have our system is such that in order to get like a bachelor's degree in something, you would take 3 full semesters of classes in that specific topic. And then you would add 3 semesters of something else. And then you'd typically the topic that you want your degree to be in is the one you would have to write a student thesis in. And that would take you some weeks. 10,000 words thesis. So we have students who take all 3 of these courses in sequence so that they can get a bachelor's degree in intelligence analysis. So that means that they typically already have the other experience from other subjects. And in some cases, it's political science. Some cases, it's criminology. And some cases, it's even people who have with engineering backgrounds and stuff like that. Some of them are just students. Most of them are, I think, safe to assume, looking for a career in intelligence. Some people are already working in law enforcement specifically, or the military. And probably they are looking to apply for an intelligence position within the organization they're already employed. And they think that this might help leverage them and improve their chances of getting a job like that. And we have a lot of good cooperation with our intelligence community. So we're a small country, so our intelligence community is, I think, more closely knit and also somewhat broader in what they do. So we have meetings here in Lund for our intelligence community practitioners, including also private sector representatives. So we meet maybe, I think, between 3 and 4 times a year.
Wow.
We have people, typically they travel to Lund from Stockholm and other places in the country, and then we meet up around lunchtime, just after lunchtime, and then we have like meetings all through the afternoon and evening, and then the day after we pick it up again, and then we have meetings until lunch, and then we wrap it up. And these are very, very, I think, very productive meetings, because we don't discuss operational stuff, nothing that would be sensitive or require, information security or something like that. So we just discuss stuff like research. So people come from our university and from other places and present their research to practitioners. Practitioners talk more strategic issues with each other, with us. What's the direction next 10 years, for example? What are important developments? What do we need to talk about with each other, like long-term stuff, strategic stuff? So we have people from the military, we have people, law enforcement, we have both like counterintelligence, but also traditional policing, we have customs, we have prisons, we have tax authority, all sorts of people. Yeah, they're actually, people tend to overlook them, but at least here they have a pretty interesting niche in intelligence, because they detect kind of financial crime, which is something you can use to finance organized crime or finance terrorism and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people. I laugh because we have a different sense of the tax system between us and you guys in Sweden. We look a lot. Well, I would say we look down on taxes a lot more than you guys would. And not to say who's right or wrong, I don't know. I'm not a financial guy, but it's an interesting thing to bring up because yeah, you're exactly right. If when doing counterterrorism, you're basically looking at financials and you're following the money. That's the one thing we're always taught. If you want to figure something out, if you want to see who's the leader here, follow the money. Who's funding it and where's it funneling down to? So
Yeah.
it's interesting that you guys have that with your tax agency.
Yeah, we have several agencies tasked with like following the money and using intelligence to get more information on transactions and money flows and stuff like that. So we have the tax authority. We have a special. I don't remember what the English translation is, but we have an agency that basically collects debts that people have in the name of the government. They are also tasked with, for example, if someone has major outstanding debts because they're not paying taxes, perhaps because they're in organized crime, then they can confiscate cars, watches, cash, stuff like that. Well, and we also have a special agency, separate one that handles financial crime specifically.
Okay.
And a funny, also should mention that a funny irony of this, when you talked about popularity of tax authorities,
Yeah.
is that the tax authority in this country, even though we're quite heavily taxed, as most people know, the tax authority is one of the most popular agencies. They enjoy a huge amount of trust with the public, which is kind of funny. Yeah.
This is, I mean, I would love to sit down and talk to, just a group of diverse Swedish people, diverse Swedes, just to hear that, because you don't hear it here in the U.S. I mean, there are, certain, we've got forms within the government that would consider themselves democratic socialists that are very positive about, the taxes, especially the tax system in Sweden. And but I would say the majority of people, when tax season comes around, it's a very negative sort of thing. So it's so interesting to hear that. And so you said associate professor,
Assistant professor.
yeah, as an assistant professor, you're talking with the intel community within the military and other forms, or you have a say in telling them what you're thinking may happen in the future. We're talking 5-10 years down the line. Hey, here's my theory. Can we do an analysis of competing hypotheses on what could actually happen?
Well, basically, we have these meetings, and sometimes I meet them, on a more bilateral basis, just me as well. So I participate in training analysts and management people in intelligence agencies here, in law enforcement specifically. So they do most of their training themselves, but I kind of add my own perspectives to it, and I have some modules that I teach. So that's one way of getting my perspectives. But also I talk to them when I have training. It's not like I show up and then lecture them and I walk out. It's more like I present this is my take, and this is kind of what I pick up from research and from science, and what do you think about this, and how in what way is this useful to you? And then usually we have a bit of a discussion, and then I can pick up some lessons learned, and then I can use them and implement them and continue to evolve my teaching in this way. But also we have meetings, like I said, and it's pretty informal. So we talk about stuff, and we usually talk in a group setting. So I'm just one member of the group, and the group is typically the majority of the group will be practitioners from the agencies, and then a bunch of us academics, and we give our 2 cents and they give their 2 cents. And then sometimes we come up with new ideas together, and sometimes new insights, and we don't always agree, obviously, but we get an idea of what the others are thinking and what the others are worried about, and what these kind of opportunities, threats they see. And then we can keep each other's, we're all kept up to date. And I think that's very valuable, that we have this reoccurring structure where we meet and make sure that we are kind of keeping ourselves up to date on what everyone is thinking about.
So then I think we got 15, 20 more minutes that we can talk. I don't want to take up too much of your time. So then I think the final thing I'd like to discuss is what is Sweden worried about over the next 5 years? And then more to that, what are you focused on over the next 5 years?
I think what Sweden is worried about in the next 5 years is, well, Russia is
always, yeah,
always
top of the list.
always a concern from a national security perspective. So Russian intelligence activities. I mean, the one thing is national security in a very general sense, that, you know, the military threat from Russia and what are they planning to do and what kind of capabilities do they have. That's always something to keep in mind, always something that we need to stay focused on and up to date on. But then we also have, of course, the intelligence threat. There's been an increased indications, I should say, of an increased use of illegals and other kinds of people who do not operate under diplomatic cover. So that's something to keep in mind for the future. When are they going to show up in greater numbers, and how are they going to construct their legends and cover stories, and how are we going to detect them, and so on. But also organized crime is a major issue in Sweden right now. We're really struggling with a lot of organized crime and how to use intelligence to fight it. And I think, from my point of view, I think it's very interesting to look at some of the American experiences in fighting organized crime, because I mean it's something that the U.S. has a lot more experience in doing and has done over several periods of time in different settings. And I think that all that adds up to a very interesting base of experience and cases that I've been looking at. And in some cases, there are a lot of things we can't do because our legislation won't allow it. And I think that's one of the things that we should address and look at, because not everything has to be a trade-off between at least not as big a trade-off between public safety and, you know, and personal integrity and that kind of thing. Sometimes, for example, since I'm interested in deception and manipulation and that kind of thing, I've been looking at classic sting operations that the FBI have been using. And I know that sting operations is a thing that is very difficult to do in Sweden, because the legislation wasn't designed for that kind of thing. And it just puts up a lot of obstacles. But I know that sometimes they've tried to run sting operations, and I don't think it. I mean, there've been some results, but I think they could have been done a lot better, a lot more efficiently. Although that might require some minor reforms in terms of legislation. But I don't think it would be that big of a trade-off, and I think that it could produce very interesting results. But I think that organized crime and Russia will probably remain major issues. Of course, then it's also stuff like climate change and pandemics. I don't do that much work on those topics, but I know that from like a broader intelligence community view, I think that pandemics and climate change is also going to be, and AI, of course, also going to be stuff that's going to be on the radar.
Yeah, that's not something. So I'm glad you brought that up. The climate change factor, because the last few years the United States has put out a national security briefing, a greater intelligence briefing, and climate change has entered that just because of the effects that could happen with if the world continues to warm, what are we going to do? So do you see that as something that the intelligence community can help out with? How do we defeat climate change? How do we protect ourselves from whatever the risk may be? Rising seas, hurricanes, weather, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I think the intelligence community can contribute to it by highlighting stuff that is directly associated with societal risk and crisis management and crisis preparedness. And I think that, in a best case scenario, I think the intelligence community could help possibly bridge some of the divide and polarization by presenting, this is our view of the real risks and what we should do to mitigate those risks and how serious they are. Because I think that in this context, the intelligence community should be seen as a more impartial kind of factor that doesn't have any allegiance to the science, to the people in science who are doing it. So you can't really accuse the intelligence community of being partial. I don't think that you should accuse science of being partial anyway, but I know that some people are inevitably going to do that. But even those people, I think, might find it at least more difficult to pretend like the problem doesn't exist if the intelligence community also presents the same picture. So it might help convince more people, and it might help add more perspective to the issue, I think.
So does the intelligence community do that by writing it in a certain way or presenting the information in a sort of way, or just being completely open and honest about everything that's going on? Just open up all the books and say, hey, this is exactly what we're seeing. We're not going to put any classifications on it.
I think that probably it's going to be easier to discuss as an issue. I don't see how it would be as much as associated with clandestine sources as a lot of traditional intelligence, because this is not the kind of stuff you're going to get from a source in the Kremlin who tells you something at a bar or whatever, or like copies documents. So, the advantage here is that I think the intelligence community can present views on this in a quite a transparent manner, because pretty much all of this information is probably going to be open source. The only exception I can come up with is if something is also supported by more covert censors of some sort, and you might.
Yeah, I was thinking of that as well.
Yeah, so that might be one scenario, but of course you can always use traditional ways of dealing with that and saying that we can't give you all the data we use for this conclusion because it might compromise some covert censors, but we agree with this estimate, for example. I think that that's still a valuable contribution because it comes from another source, and one that has, even if some people will probably continue to think that the intelligence community has all these nefarious agendas and whatever, and they'll probably try to read into this that the whatever conspiracy theory they're having, that the intelligence community is just going to be using climate change as a way to support whatever.
Right, they can't show us the sensors or the radars because it's creating what's going on instead of...
But some people you're not going to be able to reach no matter what. Right. But maybe some other people who are more like on the fence, maybe they think, oh, is it really that serious? Maybe the scientists are exaggerating because they want funding. Maybe those people are more receptive to it. Okay, so the intelligence community is also saying it, and I trust them to be impartial in this. So it's not going to convince everyone, but I think for some people it might be a way of like reminding or opening up their views on this.
Yeah, I think that's the better way to focus it. I was first, the mindset for me was, how do we convince everybody that anything that's divisive is actually important, and it could harm you. But like you said, you don't have to convince everybody, because you're not going to convince everybody. But if you can get those people on the fence, if you can get, the majority of people who are moderate thinking individuals to rethink the whole situation. And it's not just climate change, it's everything that we discussed that we're so divisive about. Well, like I said, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I do want to give you a few moments to just, tell everybody where they can find you. And if you have anything that you're working on, you would like to get out there, I'd love for you to just let our audience know.
So you can find me on Twitter at Tony Ingesson in a single word. I'm guessing you're gonna put my name in the title or somewhere.
Oh yeah. And I'll put your Twitter into the show notes. And I do tell everybody, please go follow that. It's not just about the cancer research. Tony puts out some really good analysis, especially the World War I and World War II stuff that you've been putting out recently. I was very fascinated by that.
Thank you. So if you look at my easiest way to get, if you look at my Twitter, you can find, I have a thread there, like a pinned thread, where you can find links to my open access stuff, including my PhD dissertation. And if you don't use Twitter, you can pretty much Google my name, and I think you're going to find my like my university portal webpage, where you can find also links to the stuff I've been producing. And like I said, most of it, a lot of it, at least, is open access, and it's not like you don't have to register or anything, because my university has paid a lot of money to make it open access. So you should really make the most of it. And just if you're interested, you can read all of that stuff exactly as it was written and published.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I do appreciate all of that, because it's transparency and just getting it out, to the public. If you want to read it, go ahead. I highly recommend reading it. Tony, thank you so much again for coming on. This is a wonderful conversation. I can't wait, to see that peer-reviewed paper out, and we can start fighting cancer with intelligence analysis.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I had a great time.
All right. Thank you, man.